Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. The Australian settlement, the set of policies which largely governed Australia's national development for its first 60 years, stayed in place despite changes of government between the Labor Party and the Liberals and their predecessors. Why was it that both sides of politics, who professed such ideological disagreement about how to govern Australia, could actually agree on so much? And while the Australian settlement was replaced by the Liberal reforms of the 80s and 90s, again, both sides of politics accepted this change was inevitable. Joining me to discuss settlement politics in Australia and its history and whether we've reached the end of it is Robert Menzies Institute fellow Dr. Damien Freeman. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Damien.
Thanks, Georgina.
It's great to have you on, finally. It's been a few years, but we've got here in the end, and you've written a book about the end of settlement, and I think we better start our discussion with a definition here. What is settlement politics?
So I take my idea of settlement politics largely from the book that Paul Kelly wrote called The End of Certainty, which is his history of the 1980s and what happened in the 1980s. And his understanding of what happened in the 1980s is that it is an undoing of a settlement that had existed for the first 80 years in Australia. He traces this back to Alfred Deakin, and indeed, if we're honest, he relies a lot on a book by Sir Keith Hancock called Australia, which was published in 1930. And he's really the one that sets up this idea that in Australia, there were settled policies. There was a package of broad ideas that everyone in Australian politics had come to agree about, and that had persisted for 80 years. And in the 80s that they realised that, well, some people had known this earlier on, but although they agreed that these were the policies that they would govern the country by, they weren't necessarily sound policies. In particular, a lot of work had been done on this idea of protectionism, and it was clear by 1930 that protectionism was not economically a good idea, but it persisted for political reasons. By the time that we get to the 1980s, there's a very clear sense that it's not going to work anymore. We just can't keep going with this artificial way of organising the economy. And there's a change. And as you say, kind of what's interesting about this is that both sides of politics agree that there needs to be a change, that we're going to have to do things differently. And I think the interesting thing when you look back at the 20th century is, yes, there's this radical change in how the country is going to be run, the policies that are going to underpin it, but there's always seemed to have been this sense that people could find some kind of broad agreement about how to do things. And this is really the idea that I get to with settlement politics. I'm not saying that everybody agreed about everything. That's clearly not the case, right? At every point, you can see people have different aspirations for the country, the people in the political class. It's not that they are all looking for the same thing, but they can somehow see that whatever they want the country to look like, they can see that they're going to have to work in the same way. And this leads to this idea of a settlement, of trying to find a way forward that we can all live with, even if it's not your ideal or my ideal. And this is broadly, I think, what I'm trying to get at and draw attention to the fact that this was a feature of Australian politics for 100 years. Most people, I think, would readily acknowledge it's less a feature of contemporary politics than it was in the last century.
So it's an interesting thesis, and obviously, I mean, Paul Kelly's made a great name for himself out of this analysis of Australian politics from the pre-80s through the 80s, 90s, and he's continued to write largely about these larger trends. But is this something that we see just in Australia? The way we do politics is through, well, at least up until recently, has been done through this settlement politics, that there's sort of a broad agreement on the direction Australia is going in, but it's this quibbling perhaps around the edges and the implementation that divides the parties in the end? Or I mean, is this something you see in Britain, in the United States? I guess say. My very quick view is you don't see it in the United States, quite a different sort of politics there. But yeah, it'd be interesting to hear whether this is something that came out of Australian federation politics and then Fred Deakin sort of continued on and implemented it.
So I think it definitely gets going in a particular way from the time of federation on. I mean, remember, you've got a new country that comes into being and they've suffered a recession at the end of the 19th century. So this is a difficult time. They're trying to establish a new country. They're trying to bring together, because now it's easy for us perhaps to think that people from all these different parts of the continent are part of the same nation. But that was a new idea then. I mean, they were much more conscious of their own rivalries than they were of what they had in common. They did have things in common and they could draw on that, but it was an achievement that they could do that. And I think, where did this come from? I explained in my book that I think this is something that Australian politicians had received from England, and I suggest that the beginnings of this at an earlier period, this is sort of developed over 300 years in England from the time of the Elizabethan settlement onwards. I think this is particularly something that has to do with the Church of England, and I'm impressed here by a book that Sir Roger Scruton wrote called Our Church. And it's in that he explains that what he thinks is the most distinctive thing about the Church of England is this sense that it's a settlement. And it is a really remarkable idea. I mean, our sense of tolerance, maybe it's changing now, we're comparatively tolerant of religious difference. That was certainly not the case in England at the time of the Reformation. And this attempt to abolish Catholicism under Henry VIII, to bring it back under his daughter Mary, to this constant coming and going. And what you saw with Queen Elizabeth I was this idea of a settlement, which was to say, look, there's fundamental disagreement here about important issues. In those days, religious issues. It was to say we can all be part of the same church. We can all be part of one community. We can be faithful members of the church, even though we have different views about ritual and even though we have different views about doctrine. And these are actually fundamental differences in that world. But we could still be part of this Church of England. And that's because the Church of England was able to arrive at statements about doctrine and ritual that involved a degree of ambiguity, that said, we can set out our position as a church in a way that allows for the fact that people see things differently, and we don't have to agree about every small thing. And we can have different ways of understanding what it means to be, in that case, a Protestant Christian, and that's kind of okay, right? We can live with that. And this is a remarkable achievement. Like, so you don't have to fight to the death. You don't have to destroy your enemy. You can actually live with the fact that we're part of a community in which some people see things one way, other people see things another way. And I think this is actually really central to the way English democracy gets going, that the political tradition in England, and one that comes to Australia. And I think that's really the origin of this way of thinking.
So the English and Scottish and Irish and Welsh who came to Australia in the 19th century, they were bringing with them the traditions, the governance ideas, the religious ideas and philosophical ideas of Britain, of the United Kingdom. I mean, how were they then translated into the Australian context to, I guess, inculcate this Australian settlement that started off in the very early 20th century?
I think you have a parliament that's brought together people from what were different colonies, now different states, trying to find a way to work together. It's a gradual process that our two-party system gets going, and this need to sort of say, well, the big debates of the day, how can we find ways of somehow accommodating difference? Our ambitions for the country may be a bit different, but we can also see that we're going to have to work together if we want to get anywhere, right? It never changes that I think some people are always trying to push the country in one direction. Others are trying to push the country in a different direction. But they can sort of see that the means of doing that is going to be the same sort of thing. There's an element of pragmatism here, and I think it's a fact that ideology was never particularly strong in Australia. The people were always more pragmatic and willing to find accommodations. I'm not saying they didn't believe in anything, but they were willing to, one way of saying it would be to fudge it, another way would be to say that they were prepared to have a degree of ambiguity in how they would articulate things. I think that a really important example of this was the idea of socialism without doctrine, which is an idea that Albert Meytin articulated. He wrote a book in French with this as the title. This idea became very important. He came and studied at the end of the 19th century. He went to Australia and New Zealand and made a study of what was going on. And what he observed there, whilst there were no socialist governments and the governments were not very keen at all on socialist ideology, they were nevertheless implementing what might be regarded as socialist ideas. There was what's been described as state paternalism, the idea that the state had a responsibility to look after people, and this had been a long tradition in Australia, and Hancock points out there are historical reasons for this. It had to do with the difficulty of settling the continent, and that in order for that to happen, the state needed to underwrite activities in a way that wasn't the case in America, because the geography in America meant it was just much easier to go and set up farms and things, and in Australia it was much harder. And he says because of that, there'd always been an understanding that there was a role for the state in helping to support people. And he says this evolved into this idea of socialism without doctrine, or what's been called state paternalism, that the state had a role in helping people. Now, this is not an ideological point, right? And this was something that you could accept in Australia, even if you were not a socialist, technical sense. And there's this long history of people seeing the circumstances of Australia mean the government needs to help. If we're going to settle this continent, it's only going to be because there's help.
So this Australian settlement that develops with Alfred Deakin and continues on until the Hawke era, this partly comes about because of the sort of Australian geography, you're arguing, and the Australian small population, and the fact that we are a country of settlers. I mean, obviously Indigenous population was here before, but the larger population flows come as pioneers, basically opening up new land, and it's hard country. There's not a lot of fertile land in quite a large proportion of the country, and it's great distances, and there's obviously lack of communication and infrastructure. So all these aspects of this new country or these new colonies meant that we needed a set of policies that would deliver the economic development that was required, that, you know, the population growth in order to make this country a successful one. Tell me then, Damien, you've talked about state paternalism, but so Keith Hancock's book Australia in 1930 did identify 5 sort of key policy areas that really stuck until the Hawke era and started with the Deakin era. What, in addition to state paternalism, do you want to describe what those policies were?
So Hancock is very clear that there's one policy that underpins all the other policies in Australia, and that is what he calls the policy of white Australia. He's very clear that everything else depends on this idea of the white Australia policy. Of course, that's something that nobody likes to talk about anymore, and everyone thinks it feels terribly embarrassed to talk about the significance of that legacy in Australia. But it had a very important legacy. It was terribly important, whatever we might think of it now, because that was the basis for creating social cohesion in Australia. And it's easy now to be critical of this, but you had 6 colonies that were still, okay, Victoria had been quite prosperous with the gold rushes, but beyond that, the idea that you could make a country out of these 6 colonies, it was a precarious situation. It was important to establish what it was that would be the basis of social cohesion. What was it that was going to make us all be able to commit to work together to solve our problems? And a very important part of that was the idea, well, we're all the same, we're all British, we're all part of the British race. This was a basic idea that was the starting point. So this is the number one thing. The other two interlinked policies are those of protectionism and industrial arbitration. And there's a history of how it is that now the big division is sort of between Labor and non-Labor in Australian politics, right? The Labor Party and the non-Labor parties, the Liberal Party and the National Party. In those days, the big division was between protection and free market. That was the really, really big dispute at the time of Federation. And in the end, it was protectionism that won out, and the free traders, those who were opposed to protection, for various reasons saw that their interests lay in siding with protectionism, even though they knew that it was clear it was never really going to work in the long term, but for political reasons, people saw their interests lay there. But the deal, why was it that this could be so effective? Because the deal was that it was tied to industrial arbitration. So the idea that we would have a fixed wage system which would protect the interests of workers in return for agreeing to pay fair wages, manufacturers would be guaranteed that their industries would be protected. So this was the idea of protection all round. Everyone gets something. And the White Australia policy fitted with this because part of it was also, we'll keep out the cheap labour. We won't let in those people from overseas who will work for lower wages. So this combination of things meant that somehow everyone's interests were being balanced, and there was a way that we could make this work, even if none of us, if you were starting from scratch, no one would have said this was a good idea. So that is state paternalism, which I talked a bit about. And the last thing that's added is the idea of imperial benevolence. So this idea that Australia was to be protected originally by the British Empire and then after the fall of Singapore by the United States. So always the idea that our defence involved
a great and powerful friend.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, that Alfred Deakin is calling himself a liberal, that the non-Labor side of politics, it calls itself liberal, despite the fact that when you look at all these policies, they are quite illiberal. They involve protection, protection from immigration from countries other than Britain, protection in the form of tariffs, protection in the form of no sort of free market for wages. It's centralised wage arbitration, protection from want and poverty underpinned by elements of state paternalism, and then protection from the British Empire, or in the end, the United States. We were provided that protection from, enemies from the east and the north. So it's interesting that in the end, Australia has a protectionist set of policies, yet professes to come from liberal origins.
Well, if it had been said that Australia embraced socialism without doctrine, perhaps it also embraced liberalism without doctrine. Part of this, I think you have to understand this idea of freedom that was very deep. British people who came to Australia, they were very committed to this idea of freedom. But as Hancock says, they saw early on that how you were going to afford people freedom and free lives in Australia was going to require a degree of state intervention. It was going to require the state to help out and to protect people and make it possible for people to be free. And he says this was just the package of how it played out, that these people had a very strong sense of themselves valuing their freedom and thinking freedom was terribly important. But they also just saw that as being compatible with the state intervening in ways that would be unacceptable if you were a sort of ideological liberal. But that's a relatively late development in Australia. That really only starts in the 70s and 80s when people in the Liberal Party start to become interested in Hayek, in Adam Smith, in Milton Friedman. They start to actually think about this in a sort of a more philosophical way. That's a relatively late development, and it was a development that was necessary in order for the Liberal Party to understand why it had to abandon the Australian settlement, because the Liberal Party was a conservative party. It was about upholding the Australian way of doing things, and the Australian way of doing things involved protectionism. It involved wage arbitration. It involved a whole lot of things that you can say intellectually those are not liberal things, but they'd been part of the Australian way, and it was very hard. And this was the challenge at the time of Fraser, is that Fraser is a sort of old-fashioned conservative here who's deeply committed to preserving the Australian way of doing things. And the Australian way of doing things was protection, wage arbitration, all these sorts of things. And it's only when there's this whole change in the Liberal Party where people start to rediscover what classical liberalism is and to think about this from first principles and to realise why actually, if we're committed to liberalism, we have to let go of some of these things. And pragmatism also says to us now, we're going to have to let go of it because it's just not going to keep working. But I think on the Labor side, pragmatism is important in the 80s. On the Liberal side, it's a philosophical change. It's people saying, actually, these ideas are important and we should be committed to them.
It would be interesting to explore how that concept of freedom and the acceptance of state paternalism and state protectionism across all those facets that you've explained was deemed as necessary in Australia but not the United States, I would suggest, and why that developed so differently. Because while the United States has a difference in geography, it is a very, very large country territorially, very, very large. I mean, it has more access to water and arable land, so you could argue, well, it was easier to make a go of it without the helping hand of government. But I mean, in the United States, there's a deep commitment to not allowing the state to get involved and to being individually and personally responsible for your own protection of your own wealth and creation of your own wealth, your family. But I wanted to ask you then, in the battles between, say, Robert Menzies in the 40s and Ben Chifley, the Labor Prime Minister, between 45 and 49, I mean, very much it was a battle between Menzies' liberalism and Chifley's socialism, and a big part of the 49 campaign, the 46 campaign, but particularly, of course, the successful 49 campaign of Menzies' Liberals was attacking Chifley's socialisation agenda. In that context, how did the Australian settlement survive? Because that was quite an ideological battle. You read the campaign materials, the newspaper reporting, a lot of the rhetoric was ideological and was about Chifley's state taking over the banks and taking over all your wealth and going to tell you what to do. And we're the Liberals, we're going to be allowing private enterprise to flourish, and this will be an economy based on the individual and their efforts, not on the state and its protection.
Yeah, look, I think to say that there was some sort of broad agreement isn't to say that everyone agreed about everything. I suppose at times it can get put under more pressure than at other times. That's probably going to be part of it. But I think the point about what Kelly's trying to get at with the Australian settlement and what Hancock is before him is, so there were some fundamentals that everyone accepted. So yes, Menzies disagrees with Chifley about who should control the banks. I'm not trivialising the significance of these disagreements about how the state's going to work. And this is a time, I think, when there is a rethinking of what's the role of the state. Are we going to allow the state to have a different role? But I think the point about the settlement is that there were basic ideas that both sides would still have been committed to. Like, if you talk to people on either side, you would have still found that there was a fundamental commitment to ideas like about the freedom of the individual, that Australia was a place of free Britons, that this was their understanding of themselves. And this might sound odd, but I think they would have thought that, rightly or wrongly, that if it was right to nationalise the banks, it was right to nationalise the banks because that was what we needed to do in order to secure the life of these free Britons in Australia. Now, they may be wrong about it, but I think they would say that equally the people who were against this, Menzies saying, no, we're about the small state, not enabling the state to take control of these things. I think you wouldn't see him anywhere denying that there's a role for state paternalism. And indeed, he was still thought that wage arbitration was an important thing, that these things were settled, and it was understood that there were some fundamental things that we still agreed about. Even if we were having these big disagreements about what should be the relationship between the state and the banks, I'm not saying that's a serious disagreement, right? But there's still some sense in which there's broad agreement underneath that about what we're all on about here.
So you talk about the Australian settlement, and Paul Kelly, of course, is central to his thesis in The End of Certainty, talks about the Australian settlement of Alfred Deakin really coming to an end with the advent of the Hawke government in 1983. But prior to that, you see White Australia policy, so one of the key 5 pillars of the Australian settlement, being discarded. And in fact, by 1972, Gough Whitlam's announcing that we have now a policy of multicultural Australia. Towards the end of the Menzies era, we're getting rid of quite large aspects of the White Australia policy, ending the dictation test, of course, broadening White Australia to encompass anyone who's European, and then seeing Colombo Plan scholars come in and Harold Holt really getting rid of almost everything that relates to White Australia. So this is well before the Hawke era. So that sort of aspect of the Australian settlement's gone. In terms of imperial benevolence, yes, I mean, the British Empire falls with the Commonwealth, but it doesn't offer any security protections. We have the alliance with the United States, but that is very, very strong today, but it has ebbed and flowed. The only time it's been invoked, in fact, was September 11, of course, and I must note today we are recording on September 11, and that's worth reflecting on in terms of a key moment in the alliance was when America was attacked. So I guess imperial benevolence really was challenged very much pre the Hawke era. So in a way, did the Australian settlement last that long anyway? Do you think there are deficiencies in the Kelly argument that it was really that cut off in 1983 and then we suddenly transitioned to a very different set of accepted policy parameters for Australian governments of either persuasion to pursue?
I think it's a fair point that you make. I've written enough books that I know what happens when you try and do this. Whenever you try and impose order on the facts of history, there's going to be a bit of massaging, right? There's always going to be a bit of that. And it is right to say that, in particular, the immigration system, that had really started to be reformed well before the 80s. That's definitely true. But the focus of Kelly's analysis is definitely on protectionism. And of course, it's also true that wage arbitration, which was the other important bit, didn't actually get broken down in the Hawke-Keating era. That really had to wait until Howard. So yes, look, it's true that he wants to tell the story that all of this happened in the 80s. Well, it's true. White Australia had really gone by the 70s, and wage arbitration doesn't really go until the 90s. So, okay, he's massaging it a bit, that's true, but his basic idea, I think, is still right, that there was a settled way of understanding how things were going to be done, and this did unravel. And I think the other important bit about when it starts to unravel, I mean, the fact that you talk about multiculturalism either beginning with Whitlam or with Fraser also shows this is an idea that both sides of politics are accepting. You know,
and I think that's where we could bring in John Howard, who of course had been Treasurer before the demise of the Fraser government. And John Howard's very much someone who believes in liberal economics. He would have been an admirer of Friedman and Hayek. While he doesn't become leader of the opposition, the Liberals go with Peacock. You very much see Howard's ideas implemented by Bob Hawke and his treasurer, Paul Keating, when it comes to economics. And of course, this relates to the deregulation of a lot of our industries in Australia and, of course, the lifting of protectionist tariffs that traditionally protected our industries. And these are very, very different set of economic policies that are put in place that largely have the support of the other side of politics.
Well, he was the shadow treasurer at the time, and he supported it as shadow treasurer, yeah.
So the question is, was John Howard, and is John Howard, a settlement politician? Is he committed to that type of politics as perhaps Bob Hawke may have been?
Well, in my book, I certainly argue that John Howard is an example of settlement politics. He, in his most recent book, which is called A Sense of Balance, he writes about this in a slightly different way. He says that he thinks Australian politics has always been about maintaining a sense of balance. Well, I think this is kind of a different way of saying the same thing, right? I mean, and I think it's definitely the very important role that he played in opposition, where he didn't oppose these things. And in A Sense of Balance, he writes about the fact, he says, well, I could have opposed it for the sake of opposing it when I was in opposition, but what would be the good of that? When I'd been in government as treasurer, I'd wanted to do these things. Now there was a conflict with Fraser, and Fraser couldn't make the move and couldn't see the need. And indeed, to be fair, this was a big change that was happening in the Liberal Party. I mean, it kind of became trendy at the end of Fraser's life to say Fraser was out of touch with the Liberal Party. But early on, there was this ebb and flow within the party as it was trying to come to terms with changing circumstances and the challenges. So Howard could see the need for economic reform, even though he regarded himself as a conservative, not as a radical, but he could see here there was a need for change, and he couldn't make it happen on his watch. But yes, he saw that it was in the national interest that these changes happened, and he, as he says, I criticised them for not going far enough, because I couldn't say it was a bad idea. And I think it's worth reflecting on, because I think people in Australian politics today, I think, would be a bit less cautious about that and a bit more willing to score a cheap trick rather than say, no, actually there's an important principle here and we really have to support that. I think Howard understood this idea that partly that was a really important thing he did in opposition, when he was clear that we as a Liberal opposition need to be aligning ourselves with this way of organising the economy. And it's also, though, he does develop, and he talks about in this book, the idea of a sense of balance and the idea that in Australia public policy doesn't take extreme stances, does find compromises. The best example I think he gives of that is the health system. And he says, well, we didn't go the way America, where it's all dependent on private insurance. We don't go the way of Britain, where you have the national health system and it's fully public system. He says we have a mixed system. He thinks is a distinctively Australian resolution of it. And I think this is a particularly good example for understanding part of what I think is really important about settlement politics, because you can say people on both sides of the political divide will now broadly agree that a mixed health system is the right way, that there's a role for public, there's a role for private, and that's right. Now, what I think is important to understand about that is people will justify this in different ways. Some people will justify this mixed system by saying, oh, this is really important because it provides a safety net. Other people will justify it by saying, oh, this is really important because it promotes choice, right? And those are two different ways of explaining why the same thing is good. And it's really important to understand this, because it means in the end, if you're in the Liberal Party, if you're on the right, you're more likely to think that the really important thing is you're promoting choice. If you're in the Labor Party, you're probably more likely to emphasise the safety net. When Labor's in, it will reform the system in ways that promotes the safety net. When the Liberals are in, they'll tend to reform the system in a way that promotes choice. But there's a basic understanding that this mixed system is the way forward, even if our understandings of why we're looking for it is different, and even if our aspirations for the future are different. And I think Howard was part of this world that understood that, and that, yeah, he never would have agreed. I mean, at the time of those important economic reforms, the direction he wanted to see the country going wasn't exactly the same as the direction the Labor government wanted to see it going. And I don't think he would pretend that it was.
So, Damien, this sort of Hawke-Howard settlement of liberal economics, it hasn't lasted 60 years. It's definitely had its day. You argue in your book that we've reached the end of settlement, and settlement politics, if we want to move forward, would be well advised to rediscover it and embrace it again, but we're not. We're at a low ebb of settlement politics at the moment, and the failure of the Voice referendum, which you supported, but from a conservative perspective, is a good example of the failure of settlement politics at this juncture. But why is it that the Hawke-Howard settlement didn't last? Was there something deficient in it? Was there something about the 21st century that makes settlement politics murderously difficult to undertake?
Well, it's a good question why. If I'm right in saying that we should think about the 20th century as having been a century of settlement politics, why is it the 21st century we're losing this? One thing I'd point to here is the Edelman Trust Barometer that's published each year. In 2023, the Edelman Trust Barometer for Australia showed that trust in institutions was at an all-time low, and that polarisation in Australian society was at an all-time high. And I think this is a big change. This sense of polarisation in the society is a very big change. How has this come about? There are a number of causes, right? The way the media is changing, social media, we hear about echo chambers, all sorts of things going on that have changed so much how society works and how politics is done, and the style of political leadership. And now I think it's a bit the chicken and the egg, because if you have political leaders that adopt a different attitude to what they're doing, well, that's going to have an effect. But equally, if you're an aspiring politician in an increasingly polarised world, don't be surprised that the politician starts to embrace something closer to what I call polarised politics rather than settlement politics. Because if you're in the kind of world that is highly polarised, the way to success is going to be different politically. And I think we are seeing quite a different world, and a world that is less willing to be accommodating of other people, more determined to emphasise difference. I think you can identify things that are happening on the left politically and things that are happening on the right politically. I don't think the same things are happening on the left and the right, but I think different trends on either side are sort of making people on either side of politics increasingly polarised, and their expectation of leadership is increasingly polarised.
I think there's something interesting you bring up in your book, which is how, as you say, those on the left and those on the right are becoming increasingly polarised through an adoption of, say, identity politics on the left, and seeing all problems as the result of the actions of oppressors against a particular identity group. Whereas on the right, you have this rise of populism, which sees all problems as the result of decisions of elites, and they're opposed to elites. So you have opposition to oppressors and elites, who often may be one and the same, actually. So your populists and your identity politicians, they actually end up not really liking the same group of people, but for very, very different reasons. So maybe there is room for a settlement between the two groups, whether it's I guess I'm a pretty centrist liberal. Myself, I probably would feel deeply uncomfortable with the direction that would go in, but others may think that might be how Australian politics evolves to a next set of settlement politics.
Yeah, look, it may be. This concept of totalitarianism was about the fact that people saw that there were similarities between fascist governments and communist governments, even though they were profoundly different ideologically. You know, when you compared them both with democracy, you saw that they were quite different because they're both anti-democratic. So yeah, it's true that people who see things very differently might turn out to have similarities, unexpected similarities. The point you make is not exactly the point I make, but it's an important warning that perhaps I've pointed you towards, which is that, we need to be concerned about the fact that Australia has tended to be a sort of centrist type country politically, and there are reasons for that. It's not a foregone conclusion that it will remain like that. And we should be mindful to these concerns that, if you see the build-up of political energy on the two extremes, and if you realise that there are similarities between the way they're doing things, don't be surprised if at some point those similarities become more important than the differences. And it is a risk, and it's something I think we should be concerned about, and we should be mindful that a way of doing politics looks like it's sort of coming to an end. And I write in my book about the fact that my involvement with the referendum was about trying to find a kind of settlement as a solution. I think it became impossible, and it became impossible because all the key people were not interested in finding common ground, were not interested in a settlement. And this is because by this time they were too sold on these other ways of doing politics, and it was just too late to try and do something like that.
Do you think this is the end of settlement?
I'd like to think that we still have a choice before us, but the point about why it will be so hard to change the dial is it's not just you have to change one thing. It's not just you have to say to the politicians, you have to start talking differently. It's going to be about addressing a range of things, about the way social media plays out, about the way the echo chambers are operating, about the way the algorithms reinforce people's news feeds. There are a whole lot of different things that are conspiring to lead to this, and I don't think it's impossible for us to overcome this. One thing I'll say is I don't think the future will look like the past. If there's anything that counts as settlement politics in the future, I don't think it will be a return to the Deakin settlement. It'll look different. The world will be different in future. But I think it's important that we're mindful of this, and we're mindful that there's something that has served the country well for a long time that we're at risk of losing, and we should be cautious about losing it.
Well, I think there's a song. Be careful what you pray for. You might get it. So, Damien Freeman, thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light. It's been a great discussion. Thanks,
Georgina. I'm very pleased to be on Afternoon Light, and I'll just end by saying to you I have on my shelf my copy of Afternoon Light, which my mother bought for me. I can remember from the University of Sydney, the Chancellor's wife used to run a committee, the Chancellor's Committee, which had a book fair every year, and they sold all the second-hand books that the library wanted to get rid of, and people who had old books there. There was a big fair in the Great Hall. Anyhow, my mother went when I was a schoolboy, and she bought some second-hand books for me, one of which was Afternoon Light. So I have my copy of Afternoon Light there, and I remember fondly where it came from and enjoy reading it. So nice to be part of this.
Lovely. Thank you, Damien. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.